Hey everyone, and welcome to Module 2. Today we are talking about a variety of dogs, that is, models of the press. You'll see in a moment why I've got all these dogs up on the slide. This is essentially a metaphor that several of these different scholars have used to describe these different assumptions about the way that the press works in a given country. Now, I want to be very clear as you begin your study of this module about what we mean by a model. Now, if you think about a model in physical terms, a lot of the time you'll think about like a model airplane or a model car or some other sort of model, maybe a model of a building that an architect might put together before they actually go and build the real thing. A model is an abstraction. It's a way for us to think in general about certain kinds of objects. And of course, it doesn't have all of the nitty-gritty details that would allow that thing to function in real life. It is, of course, abstract to some degree. But models are a way for us to better understand the properties of real things. And I like the metaphor of dogs here because dogs come in all different breeds. They've got all different kinds of features. Some dogs are fluffy, some dogs have sort of short fur, some dogs are big, some dogs are small, all kinds of different properties in the diversity of different dog breeds. And so these different models of the press look and behave very differently depending upon the assumptions they're in. When we think about sort of the first scholars to really try to categorize the press in various countries according to these different theoretical models, we can certainly go back to Peterson, who's the first author that we'll be encountering in this semester. And so Peterson's work, obviously, it's very old. This is not a piece of the literature that comes to us from 2020. It's much older than that. But I think it's a really great summary of the way that scholars first began to think about sort of what the press is, right, and how journalists behave in various countries as they are subject to different kinds of incentive structures, different institutional structures, and just different even governmental structures as well. And so Peterson has this, if you look on the first page of that reading, has a very handy sort of summary of these different models of the press that he describes. The authoritarian, libertarian, social responsibility, and now defunct Soviet totalitarian models. And so especially I think it's important for us to compare and contrast the libertarian and the social responsibility models in this reading. But of course, this is not coming out of nowhere. I want to provide a little bit of background to you as you encounter this stuff for the first time. And so here we've got a picture of actually JFK here with a number of other important people, and this guy who you may or may not recognize. This is Henry Luce, who's a very famous publisher, very famous sort of media mogul of the time, and in fact somebody who sort of reigned over a large media empire for actually a large part of the 20th century. So you may recognize publications like Time and Life magazines, right? These were really big publications, and or even today in the era of digital media, still pretty important publications. But way back in 1947, far before this picture was taken, essentially the public and governments, the FDR era, World War II era government started to sort of clamor for, a new mentality of the media. And this really sort of follows along in a longer sort of history of these kinds of appeals, where the public started to say, hey, if we think about this core concept of democratic linkage, and of course they weren't using these kinds of technical terms, but we discussed this in the last module. If we think about linkage, it seems like our press is maybe falling short of that standard. There's a lot that we don't know about how government is functioning. There's a lot of sort of our expression as the public that isn't being heard by elites. And so we want to make sure that this democratic linkage is strengthened. And so Henry Luce was somebody who, obviously being important in media at the time, said, hey, I agree with you. I think we should do something. And so Henry Luce actually got together with a whole bunch of, famous and important academics at the University of Chicago and said, hey, let's put together this commission. And so these people got together, 12 famous academics got together and created the Commission on the Freedom of the Press, which was also known as the Hutchins Commission, due to the name of one of the most important of the scholars at the time. And essentially the argument here that Luce was making is that it is imperative that a commitment of social responsibility be imposed on mass media, imposed being a very critical term there, where essentially government and journalistic elites all came to agree that we need to do something to make sure that our media institutions are capable of providing democratic linkage. And so that democratic linkage took the form of a thing called social responsibility. And so if you think about it, this is actually a contemporary American innovation. It's something that really only had its roots in the 20th century. It's a new phenomenon. And if, in fact, we'll talk much more about this as we go through the course. But for much of American history, American journalism was as much the wild, wild west as was the actual, physical geography of the United States, right? We are to some extent a peripheral kind of country for much of our history as we developed and sort of turned ourselves from a backwater into a leading sort of economic and political force in the world. And with that political and economic development came a new attitude towards the press. Because the press is really important, actually, towards the fulfillment of both of those goals, right? Being a modern democratic society and having a good economy. And so prior to the early 1900s, the U.S. press model was characterized by a number of different sort of defects. One being, and we'll talk much more about this later, sort of massive levels of partisanship and partisan contestation in pretty much all news sources. Pretty much every news source was explicitly bound up with a political party. And so you had, almost always sort of biased journalism that everyone recognized as being biased on purpose. You also had essentially sensationalism, right? This idea that unverifiable political reports, unverifiable news stories about things that were happening were published in all kinds of journalistic outlets, specifically to try to just grab attention. And so there was this big competition for attention. And even up into the 1940s, we saw that many journalistic outlets were still engaging in this kind of tabloid sensationalism, leading again to these calls to try to fix the problem. And so, the first people to really call upon the media to sort of get their act together was actually progressive era reformers of an earlier era. So beginning in, as maybe even as early as the 1890s up through the 1910s and 20s, we had a number of individuals, scholars and activists saying, hey, we need to fix this problem. And so the first step in creating this kind of watchdog model for American press was to establish journalism schools. So schools of journalism and mass communication. And especially this was a Western phenomenon, something that originated in states like Missouri, states like Indiana, even states like Illinois. This is, it's no mistake, perhaps, that these leading sort of scholars that were assembled by the Hutchins Commission were at the University of Chicago and not, say, Columbia University or Harvard or MIT or Yale. This is a kind of a Midwestern story. It has Midwestern origins and Midwestern sensibilities. But from the 1920s to the 1940s, journalists themselves began to bind themselves more intently to these different journalistic codes of ethics. And we're going to talk much more about that in later weeks, about what those codes of ethics actually entail and what it means to actually behave like a socially responsible journalist in 2021. But essentially, this watchdog model goes beyond just the role of journalists themselves, this individual role, this individual sort of training, to contend now with some new assumptions about the industry itself. And so the social responsibility model, if you go back to Peterson, that sort of first page that I've included on the PDF, the social responsibility model makes an assumption about what the media is designed to do. And so the Hutchins Commission essentially made the case that, and Peterson sort of paraphrases this, that the point of media in the social responsibility model is really about trying to raise conflict to the plane of discussion. The plane of discussion, not a physical sort of jet plane, not something that you could go for a ride on, obviously. This is what we mean by the plane of discussion, and raising conflict to it really harkens back to some original sort of democratic theory concepts about what sort of democratic governance is all about. Democracy and having a democratic government is about creating essentially an arena, a place where it's possible to create conflict that is safely secured by the absence of real political violence. So it's a place where you can come to duke out your problems, to argue with one another, to forcefully disagree, but at the end of the day to shake hands and go home. Or I guess in COVID times to, elbow bump each other and then go home, right? And no one is able to inflict violence upon another person for their disagreements. And so you can see that conflict is inherent in a democracy. It's something that we do all the time. That's why we have these political institutions, is to process our conflict in a nonviolent way and figure out who gets what at the end of the day. And so raising this conflict to the plane of discussion essentially means that we're going to take the kinds of political conflicts that we might experience in government, but we're going to make this an arena that's open to the public to talk about. It's a thing where discourse and discussion of rank and file members of a society is possible. And so this is a really important purpose, if you think about it, right? It's to say, not only is this going to be essentially a violence-free kind of conflict that government is going to foster, but it is an arena that's going to be broadcast, made available to the public so they can provide their input and they can cheer for their home team and they can cheer against their opponents. And they'll be able to share strategies and they'll be able to share instructions to their combatants in that arena about what to do. And so that is a really important function. And certainly it differs very, 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 wholly, totally from the assumptions of previous, older sort of models of the press, as we'll see in a moment. Importantly, the social responsibility model also makes assumptions about who controls the content that actually finds its way to the pages of newspapers, finds its way on television, finds its way onto the web. Content is controlled, and by that we mean both the availability of what's on the agenda and also the potential to limit discussion in certain ways, censorship of some kinds, is determined by this mixture of different forces, one being the community's opinions themselves. So the idea being that journalists have a keen ear to the ground where they're listening to what the public actually wants them to cover, and they're setting an agenda that is created on the basis of those needs. Communities are expressing their needs to journalists and they're responding by providing the stories that they think that they need. But in addition, we also have consumer action, which is to say that this is not a model that's wholly and entirely predicated on journalists just behaving in a way that's responsible. They're also behaving in a way that is going to make sure that they can remain profitable, because this is largely, but not wholly, a private model. And so that's another distinction here. This is not state-owned media. This is not media that is entirely run by the federal government or something, where you've got a national broadcasting service that is the sort of only service in the marketplace providing news. There are consumers who are choosing to purchase news in a variety of sources, and their actions are also in part driving the preferences and the behaviors of different media sources. And then finally, we again trace professional ethics back to that earlier progressive period of the 1910s, 1890s through the 1910s and 20s. Professional ethics obviously come to play a huge role in this model, because there's an assumption that journalists who are working for reputable journalism firms and media producers are going to make sure that they try as much as possible to avoid sensationalism, to veer away from being tabloids and publishing false reports and things that they can't verify, that they'll act in a way that, again, seeks to fully inform the public of the things that they need to know in order to raise conflict to the plane of discussion. Critically, the social responsibility model also assumes that if this role of raising conflict to the plane of discussion, to providing the audience with the tools that they need to be able to engage in the nonviolent conflict of politics, if that isn't happening, then government can step in and say, social responsibility model is not happening. You all need to behave a little bit better. So we're going to try to influence the marketplace by, putting certain regulations, for example, on you, making sure that you provide certain educational programming, educational content. But also the government may get involved as well and say, it's up to us also to ensure that there's somebody in the marketplace who's providing, accurate, verifiable, vetted news about what's going on in the country, and also, news that follows an agenda that pays attention to the stories that matter to the public for them to make informed political decisions. So this is not a purely public model. It's not a model where government controls all the press. It's also not a purely private model in which private companies have complete reign over what they do and say. It's a regulated model, a model where government does play a role in influencing the way that media do their jobs. So the watchdog model, these assumptions, if we were to contrast them to other breeds, right, of sort of media models, we can think about that there's a number of actually really, really important differences in these models in terms of the kind of content that they're likely to produce. And so, for example, we think about the libertarian model. That's going to be perhaps the most important contrast that I want you to think about in this study of Peterson. The first question is, in the libertarian model, who owns the media? Who is it that's actually controlling the media? What is the purpose of this press? Which, to spill the beans a little bit, obviously this is a private, conceived of as a largely private enterprise. What's the point of this private press? Is it to, raise conflict to the plane of discussion, or is it something else? And if those purposes are different and potentially in conflict, if we were to have more of a libertarian style press than a social responsibility type press, I want you to think carefully about the kinds of coverage that might emerge if the press were to conform to this otherwise model. And then another question that you should really think about when reading through this reading is the question of access. And we think about this idea that in the social responsibility model, there are many avenues, and the journalists are being very sensitive to the public's agenda, right? We said agenda setting in the first module was one of the most important, concepts of having a good democracy. In this other model, in this libertarian model, is there as much access conferred upon people who might want their voices to be heard, who might want to set the agenda? Or is there some other avenue for which access is provided? Is there another criteria, a criterion? Are there other criteria, or is there a criterion, to get my plurals exactly right, under which this access is conferred? How is it doled out? Is it doled out because of the kindness of journalists' hearts, because of certain kinds of regulations, or some other kind of model? So really think carefully about making a close comparison of especially the libertarian and the social responsibility model when you're reading through Peterson. But going further, if we were to take a look at some of the models in the other two readings for the week, we come across even rarer breeds of the press. And so first of all, we can think about the guard dog model, which this is a very different kind of model of the press that sounds at first glance much like the watchdog or social responsibility model, but in fact has many different assumptions. And we'll talk a bit about this in Module 2.2. I want to just do a little sidebar, a short video to just get you thinking about why and how the guard dog model is different, because this reading in particular is pretty dense. But the third one, I think, students in the past have found this one to be quite provocative. Some of them have agreed strongly with this idea that the propaganda model better fits the U.S. Situation. Others have strongly disagreed that the propaganda model has anything to do with reality. But this is Herman reading. This is written in 2000, and it's actually more or less a summary and a defense of an earlier argument made principally by Noam Chomsky, who's a famous sort of linguist and general scholar of critical social theory, kind of just an important political figurehead in the academy. And some would see him as being a real crank and a real sort of almost a conspiracy theory level thinker. Others see him as being a very brilliant scholar who's been able to kind of put the pieces together, right, and see the bigger picture for what it is. And so I'm very interested to see how you fall in terms of your reading of this propaganda model, because again, it is highly controversial and highly disputed, as it was when it was published, and as we'll see in 2000, as Herman responds to their critics, is criticized, for many decades to follow. And so this is more, I would say, more along the lines of what we might call a lapdog model of the press, wherein the press is completely beholden to certain elite interests. And so take a look at that one, and I'm very excited in our group discussion to see what you might think about that particular model. But the big question that I want you to entertain as you're going through the readings this week is to really think about, again, based on your own personal observations of journalism in contemporary America, based on the experiences that you've had. Maybe that's extensive. Maybe you're someone who's a real sort of press junkie. Maybe you're someone who's read a lot about journalism in the past. Maybe you've very rarely encountered political news in in your time. Regardless, based on these observations, I want you to think about, according to your experience, which kinds of dogs do you think are the most prevalent? Which model best applies to the modern press? Are we a country that's full of lapdogs that are beholden entirely to elite interests? Are we doing the social responsibility model well? Or, do most press outfits in the United States follow the social responsibility model to a T? Are we more in a libertarian sort of free-for-all, or is there something else going on? And further, because of course these models are ideal types, are there reasons to believe that maybe our dog is a mutt, much like Gus, who is just upstairs? You might have heard him jingling around a little bit with his collar. Is our dog a mutt? And by that I mean, is contemporary media sort of the contemporary environment? Is this really sort of a hybrid between some of these different assumptions? So I'm very interested to hear what you might have to say about this. Again, there's no one right answer. I think this is very much based on our observations, and I'm looking forward to a passionate discussion in our class on Wednesday about what is actually going on in contemporary America as it pertains to the model of the press that best fits our scenario. See you then.